This particular photo that you're looking at is a saloon in Tombstone, Mr. Costello's Saloon. And sometimes I do a presentation called Hollywood Mythbusters of the Old West. And everything you see in a Hollywood movie about the West, throw it out the window. What they depict the saloons look like is completely wrong. And again, I preface this with, are you in a very rural location where you had a building that functioned as the school, the church, the saloon, the community center, and a restaurant? Yeah, you did. But for the most part, a saloon was its own entity. And sometimes they had wine parlors or they had dance halls where you would have some feminine companionship. But this was your typical saloon. You see the fancy, bar. I don't know if you can see there's white cloths hanging down. Those were napkins for men to wipe their mustaches. Because contrary to what you think, what our host David did today was not common. Taking a shot of whiskey was not the norm. It was the occasional thing that happened. I'm not saying people didn't do shots of whiskey. They did, but they would sip it. But for the most part, drinks were very fancy. They were cocktails. It was that, and was another thing that surprised me. So inside you'd have this for the napkin. You would have spittoons, for you to spit. The other thing, if you notice, there's chandeliers, there's crystal glassware, there's beautiful decanters, there's beautiful carpet or flooring on the bottom. And then behind the curtain, there's a small room in the back that's got a heater, but it also has a small table. That is the only one of two places where you would have a table in a saloon, for the most part. And that was for a friendly poker game. The other table that you would have was faro. Faro was the most popular card game, gambling thing. Many you hear about Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and other people having a faro game in this particular saloon. And faro was a table, if you've ever played it or looked at it. I've dealt faro a few times for some charity events. And you would have the dealer sitting at a table, and then you'd have a lookout to make sure nobody was cheating, sitting on a stool. And then you may have had a small bench in front where a player or two would play. It's not a game that you can last very long at. The odds are 51-49 in favor of the house. So no wonder Vegas outlawed it in the 1930s, because they weren't making any money on it. And so, when you think about the pictures you see of the movies today, there's tables and chairs everywhere. That wasn't the case. People went in, men went in, they would talk politics. If they were in a cattle town, they would be talking about the price of livestock, or the chuck wagon cook, or the unruly cowhands, or you're in a mining district, you're going to be looking at the scientific journal about, the engineering and mining, the cost of silver and gold and copper. And so you're in there, you're having a quick drink, you want to cool off, detox from the day, you have to detox and have a drink, an oxymoron. But to just debrief, meet up with your fellow men, have a chit chat, and then you go home. And if you notice, there is a brass rail on the bottom, and that was for you to be able to put your foot up to relieve your back, because there was no place to sit. So that's the interior, basically what most saloons look like. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the drinks. There were often ads in newspapers for different cocktails, and you would see drinks like mint juleps, hot and cold toddies, depending on the time of the year. There was a very popular drink called Tom and Jerry. You had whiskey cocktails, you had champagne punches, you had whiskey punches, you had Collins drinks, you had sours. If you look at an old bartender's manual, there are hundreds of cocktails in there. And those were, Harry Johnson and Jerry Thomas were two of the most well-known that published books in the 1880s. And just about every, they called them mixologists, sometimes they called them chemists. That were in these particular bars, and they would all have some of these manuals. There was etiquette in it on how you should look. You have the starch white. You should never pick your teeth in front of the client. Those kind of basic habits. As a guide to what you should do in your saloon, what you should serve, how many glasses, what type of glass you should serve a cocktail in. I remember my great aunt, grew up in the 60s, lived in the 60s and 70s, and I went to her house one time, and she had like 5 cabinets of glasses. And I'm like, we have cocktail parties. I was like, what? A glass for every drink. And even in these guides, you see that. So they had a pretty extensive wall of decanters and glasses. And the one thing I want to mention, too, is, you see in Hollywood the cowboys in the cow towns, they're drunk because they're at the end of the trail. And that did happen. They would get their pay, and they'd get a bath, they'd get a meal, they'd get a woman, they'd get a drink and get drunk, and they'd shoot out the back of the bar. And that did happen. But the one thing you never see in the Hollywood movie is the next morning, those drunk cowboys going back, groveling to the barkeeper, the saloon owner, "I'm so sorry, how much do I owe you?" You know, they were remorseful for it, and they respected property. Yeah, they didn't give two craps about it when they were 3 eyes into their whiskey, but they came back the next day, and normally they made restitution for what they had done.